Well, listen, why don't we begin? I know some people are going to be trickling in late, but my name is Alan Wiseman. I'm the co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. As some of you know, the Center for Effective Lawmaking is a joint research and engagement initiative between the Frank Baden School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University. The center was founded in 2017 to advance the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the effectiveness of individual lawmakers and U.S. institutions. And we're very excited to welcome our guests this evening to engage in a discussion on matters pertaining to race and political representation, both inside and outside of Congress. So without further ado, working from my left, totally disoriented in terms of directions right now. Directly next to me, I have Dr. Michael Minta, who is a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, where he regularly teaches courses on American politics and government, especially as it pertains to African American politics, congressional politics, and interest group advocacy. He's a widely recognized and prominent expert on these topics, and he currently serves as the head of the Legislative Studies section of the American Political Science Association. He's the author of multiple peer-reviewed articles on these topics, as well as 2 books, including his recently published No Longer Outsiders, Black and Latino Interest Group Advocacy on Capitol Hill, in which he draws on large sample data analysis, as well as case studies and qualitative interviews to provide a comprehensive account of the effectiveness of minority civil rights organizations and their allies in Congress as they seek to advance their policy agendas. Next to him, we have Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. He's a Centennial Chair and University Distinguished Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies and University Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University. He's written in a variety of contexts, including as a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times and the New Republic on a wide range of topics, including race, religion, politics, hip-hop, popular culture, and contemporary issues in the African American community. He's the author of more than 20 books, including Long Time Coming, Reckoning with Race in America, the 2017 bestseller Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America, and he's also written and commented extensively on the politics of race in America, including his 2016 book, The Black Presidency, Barack Obama and the Politics of Race in America. And we're incredibly excited to be joined remotely by Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. And as I said before, Congresswoman, I'm so thrilled this connection worked. This just made my day. So Congresswoman Norton is the Democratic delegate at large representing the District of Columbia in the United States House of Representatives. Before attaining public office, Congresswoman Norton was a recognized figure as a civil rights leader and a feminist leader, a tenured professor of law at Georgetown University, and a board member at 3 Fortune 500 companies. She was first elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1990, where she currently serves as chair of the House Subcommittee, on Highways and Transit, on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. She also sits on the House Committee on Oversight. Throughout her time in the House over the last 30-plus years, Congresswoman Norton has cultivated a reputation as a dedicated and engaged lawmaker who seeks to represent the interests of her constituents, both in the District of Columbia as well as broader issues related to human and civil rights. We at the Center for Effective Lawmaking have actually ranked her as among the top 10 most effective lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, in the House for each 2-year session of Congress over the past 10 years, including the 113th Congress, and that ran from 2013 to 2015, and the 115th Congress, which ran from 2017 to 2019, where she was ranked as the most effective Democratic lawmaker in the entire United States House of Representatives. So thank you, all 3 of you, for joining us this evening. Right now, when I reached out to the 3 of them to engage in this type of discussion, the goal was to engage with broad questions pertaining to race and representation inside and outside of Congress. So my plan for the moment is I have a series of questions I want to pose to each of them, but I'm hoping this really just serves as more or less a springboard for a more free-flowing discussion on these types of topics. So to dive right into it, my first question is to you, Congresswoman. When you first entered Congress as a delegate in the House in 1991, myself, and I'm sure many members of our audience, are really curious as to how your prior experiences and backgrounds, which is quite extensive in myriad forms, including your past involvement with the civil rights movement, such as your work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, your prior government service, including serving as the first female chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as being a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. I mean, how did these past experiences come into play as you thought about what you were hoping to accomplish as a member of Congress?
Well, when I entered Congress, I refused to see myself as disempowered. So, for example, the very first thing I did was to not only introduce, but get a vote on a bill for statehood for the District of Columbia. But I did not succeed, even though Democrats were in power, because Southern Democrats dominated the Congress at that time. But it never occurred to me that I should feel disempowered. Jump right in, and if you don't get it done, keep jumping.
That's great. That's incredibly proactive, which is very consistent with some of the broader lessons that we at the Center for Effective Lawmaking have found with regards to best practices for effective legislators. Working our way this way, Professor Dyson, in the broadest sense, it's a bit of an open-ended question, so I'm just passing you the softball, so to speak. What are your perspectives regarding the efficacy of long-established advocacy groups, such as the NAACP, for representing African-American interests in Congress or within the broader public sphere?
Right. Well, it's an honor to be here. This is my Vanderbilt debut, so I'm honored, especially to join this August panel, and my dear friend, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. I'm usually testifying before her as opposed to with her, and Dr. Minta, and of course to you, Dr. Wiseman. Professor Congresswoman Norton is a perfect example. You mentioned the EEOC, you mentioned all of the incredible work she did, rewriting John Lewis's speech at the March on Washington as they demanded that it be take out all of the so-called radical parts, and being able from the very beginning to balance a demand for radical democracy with a concession to the legitimacy of political institutions, and trying to figure out a way to combine the two. And I think advocacy groups like SNCC, of which she was a seminal part, a productive part, or SCLC, NAACP, and the like, I think those groups are extremely important because they bring tremendous, tension to the political situation, and leverage their authority as grassroots organizations or as organizations that are in tune with the people, and bringing that to bear upon the political institutions that are ostensibly accountable to the people. So I think that they have been extremely important and valuable. And my own wife, who's in the audience here, Reverend Marcia Dyson, who went everything from being a member of the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad himself, to working with Jesse Jackson as his first head of Trade Bureau in 1980, and the like. I've seen it up close, and then working with the mayor of Chicago as the public information officer for the mayor's office of special events, and then seeing the ability to leverage her own, grassroots organization within the context of these organized politics is especially valuable. So I think that they serve an incredible function, and a function of at least reminding us of what we're supposed to be about, and not to give in to the kind of cynicism that says, oh, this is a bunch of politics and a bunch of politicians and we can't get anything done.
Great, thanks. Dr. Minta, I want to keep in line with this theme of the notion of outsiders coming to Congress with this question, and I want to tie this back directly to your research in your most recently published book. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on how you feel the more recently formed minority interest advocacy groups, such as Black Lives Matter, to the extent that there is a coherent organization, how do you feel they could achieve their policy goals within Congress? Or I guess another way of thinking about this is, do you think that there's lessons that could be drawn from the experience of NAACP and or LULAC and or MALDEF to help them advance their agendas within political institutions, given that they're newly formed and don't really have well-defined political rent chains and relationships yet?
Okay.
Well, first, I want to thank the Center for Effective Lawmaking, you, Alan, and Craig, for inviting me here. Nice to be in some warm weather. This is like, I hear people complaining like, "Oh man, it's cold here." I'm like, "Hey, I'll take it." This is a heat wave in Minnesota, and also delighted to be on a panel with Dr. Dyson and Representative Holmes Norton. So it's just really good to talk about this issue. And thanks to you guys for coming. Yeah, in terms of, this is kind of what led to my research when, I happened to live in towns that had uprisings. So I lived in St. Louis when they had the Michael Brown shooting. Then I moved to Minnesota and George Floyd. Wow. And, people are like, "Man, what cities are you picking?" And I'm like, "God dang." And so,
yeah, we're not going to follow you.
Yeah, I was just like, so I'm like, man, I never thought of these places as being like bastions of, of uprisings and movements. And so, but some of the questions that come up all the time, and you hear it in the Black community, what the heck is the NAACP doing? What are they doing? Irrelevant. 50s and 60s, yeah, they were doing a lot of good things, but now, what are they doing? I was like, well, I'm working on a research project about it, so let's see what they're doing, right? And so these groups, so Black Lives Matter, it provides a lot of energy, shining a light on long-term issues that groups like the NAACP, the Urban League, these groups have been fighting. That's why the NAACP was founded, right, to combat kind of like this violence against Blacks, these lynchings, this extrajudicial. So all of this stuff was happening. And so, but these organizations, these hashtag movements, and I know they're kind of unstructured, but you need like these traditional organizations to still kind of carry the fight and really, because if you want to get the law changed, particularly on the federal level, well, you need members of Congress and advocacy for that. And so those groups like the NAACP and with Latinos, you need like UNIDOS and LULAC, you need those groups. You need a lobbying presence on the Hill. But the one thing that's good, and Representative Holmes Norton knows about this from her background, is they bring that experience to Congress. They're not interest groups. It's very clear. There was a study by the Congressional Black Caucus when they first got in saying, hey, because they were many of them were extensions of the civil rights movement, are we civil rights activists or are we legislators? Mm-hmm. And you're like, why would they? Well, they concluded they're legislators, right? But they do provide that voice, that background, and in a lot of ways it helps with the advocacy of Black and Latino interests by having people who have been involved in this struggle, who fought these battles. And so, we in political science, we do a lot of stuff on contributions, political contributions to organizations, like people who give the most money get the most voice. Well, a lot of these groups, a lot of these underrepresented groups don't have the same type of money as the big business groups. They don't have a lot of lobbyists on K Street. And so what they do have are members who share their perspective that can serve as effective advocates on some of the issues that may not get the attention they would normally get. Mm-hmm. I got plenty to say, but I'll just stop right there.
Well, that's from my perspective, that serves as a really great springboard for thinking about what happens when people are successful and they do get elected into Congress. And I want to push you a little further on your own research and then turn it back to the Congresswoman, because from my read, one of the main arguments that emerges from your most recent book is essentially that the scope of policy success for minority civil rights organizations is directly attributable to the increasing scope of diversity in Congress. Mm-hmm. And the House of Representatives in particular, which you're focused on. And, it'd be really helpful, I think, for the audience, for those of us that are interested in this relationship between descriptive representation and substantive representation, for you to walk through the logic of your argument a little bit, because then I have a very specific question for you, Congresswoman, that relates to this as well and draws on your own experiences.
Yeah, so a lot of what happens that these groups do, it's behind, you don't see it all, right? And part of it is because of the of these many of these groups have charitable organizations, 501c3, like the NAACP, the Leadership Conference less so, and they're really mindful about this idea of appearing as lobbyists because they have kind of like these tax exempt status. And so a lot of what you see, what they do behind closed doors in terms of advocacy, they would never say lobbying, but it's lobbying. You don't see it. You don't see the bills that they're pushing, or you don't see like what they're providing information and research to members of Congress. You don't get a chance to see that. And so how that leads to success in a lot of ways is terms of if there's a bill, most bills die in Congress. But there's some bills, obviously, the 3% or 4% that actually pass, they have to go through the committee process. And so the one thing that Professor Wiseman was pushing me to talk about is the markup, so like amending bills in committees. Like a lot of times we like to look at voting, like, oh, how did this member vote? And you can go and see the NAACP Leadership Conference. They have a vote score to say, oh, this member is representing what we want them to do. And so you can easily say if they got 100, yeah, they're representing civil rights. If they got a 0, obviously they're not doing a really good job. But a lot of the legwork goes into the actual, what gets into the bill. And so by having more diversity, having more blacks, having more Latinos in Congress, it has provided a venue where you're having more black and Latinos on these relevant committees, whether it's House Judiciary, whether it's Ways and Means, that are looking at these bills. They're coming before their committees, and they're getting important provisions in these bills at the early stage. So by the time it gets to a vote, you already have your interests represented. Another way that these interest groups can get, where they've benefited from representation, greater diversity, is testifying at hearings by having more blacks and Latinos on congressional committees. You're seeing these advocacy groups being called in to testify more on important bills and important matters, and providing a perspective on what's important to the black and Latino community. And I've looked at over time. You don't have to do it, but I went through and looked at it over time, and then you do see these groups testifying more as you get a more diverse Congress.
Thanks. And Congresswoman, I want to turn this back to you to get your perspective, drawing on your own career, both inside and outside of Congress, and to motivate my question. There's a 2007 oral history of retired Congressman Louis Stokes, and for those of you in the audience who aren't familiar with him, Congressman Stokes was an African-American representative who represented a district in Cleveland, Ohio, for about 30 years, or 30 years exactly. And this is a wonderful oral history about, it's available on C-SPAN, and it's about his background, his motives, his strategies. But there's a quote in there that always struck me, both the first time I saw it and when I was doing other research with my co-author into lawmaking effectiveness. And the quote was essentially, "We were too limited to be all things to all black people in America," when he was first elected. And he uses that as a springboard for essentially thinking about the ways in which members of the CBC, and him in particular, viewed their position in the House and the necessity to spread themselves across different positions of influence in different committees, so that even though it might be difficult to push specific legislation through, having a seat at the table on particular committees and just having that voice in those rooms was really, really important. And we're now 20 plus years since Congressman Stokes retired. You overlapped with him a bit, but I'd be really curious, given your career and your observations, do you think that his characterization about the scope of African-American legislators' influences in Congress is accurate? Is that still present? What do you think has really changed, perhaps, over the last 20 or 30 years compared to his earlier experiences in Congress that might lead to the CBC or African-American legislators being more effective in advancing their agendas?
African-American members have more influence in large part because there are more of them and because we formed our own caucus, as you indicated, the Congressional Black Caucus. In a Congress with so many members, let's take the House, for example, with more than 500 members, if you're not in some caucus and working with other members, it's very hard for one single member to pierce and get something done either for her constituents or that her constituents need. So this is a group effort. And Congress is, whether it's the House or Senate, a set of groups working together to get bills passed. They have to break down that way to find like-minded members in order to get something done. That's particularly true of African American members whose numbers, of course, while they have increased, are shallow compared with the overall number of members of Congress. This is a group effort and a small group effort in the House, and I might say in the Senate as well, if you want to get something done.
That's really helpful. I mean, that serves as a good springboard for my next question, which is to you, Dr. Dyson. And from your perspective, being an observer of politics, movements, and the like, where do you feel that civil rights advocates, for example, could really achieve the most meaningful policy influence, especially civil rights advocates who are persons of color, inside political institutions such as Congress or outside of these political institutions? And through what mechanisms do you think policy change is most likely?
Yeah, well, I think inside it's extremely important. We have, as you already recognized empirically, we have one of the most effective legislators and lawmakers on the panel with us tonight.
I mean, the most in some Congresses, unambiguously so.
I mean, she is Eleanor Holmes Norton, so.
There you go.
And that says, now people might say, well, that's efficacy within a certain limited sphere. Well, it's a limited sphere, but it's a big one. It's an important one. It has real value. People can crap on politics and say it's all bad and all people who are involved are horrible. And that, we hear that all the time. We're in the South. We're in the Bible Belt. We hear the suspicion and skepticism, some of it legitimate, of what goes on in politics, but there's so much good that has happened for Black people, people of color, people who are poor, as a result of gaining access to something that others are tired of. When you've had 45 presidents or 43 presidents or 44 presidents, one of them ain't going, Black people got excited over Barack Obama because that's the only one we had. So, and so far, it looks like the only one we're going to have for a while. So the thing is that we got excited in a way that people are like, another president. Well, if you've had a bunch of presidents, that ain't no big deal to you. If you're used to exercising power, leveraging your authority in defense of your interests, and defining them as narrowly as you want to do without paying a consequence, that's not a big deal to you. But to those of us who have been on the outside looking in, trying to figure out a way to get inside, and as Dr. Minta's book makes clear, in terms of those representative politics and the ways in which these interest groups, these advocacy groups have tried to really make a difference inside of Congress, I think it's extremely important. I mean, when you look at Ketanji Brown Jackson just being slaughtered, right, or at least the attempt to slaughter her, she was valiant in her resistance, of Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and these political figures, who were just throwing everything but the kitchen sink at her. That had nothing to do with what she's doing. Thank God there, within that body, was Cory Booker. And Cory Booker was giving voice to a different reality. And if you don't think that makes a difference, it's not just the kind of articulation of a sensibility to resist the madness of what these other politicians represented, it's also in voting. It's also in terms of legislation. It's also in terms of, putting forth a bill finally that acknowledges lynching as, as the scourge that it is, or thinking about, bringing home to local communities resources. Now, the president is opening up the reserve right now to get some gas prices down. Some could be cynical, well, it's just a move to try to get some more votes. Well, a lot of people are hurting at the gas pump. And, politicians are about delivering critical resources in a time of crisis to vulnerable populations. And that's especially so for Black and people of color's representatives. So I think within that hall, those halls of Congress are extremely important. The legislation about voting, I mean, we can't even get that passed, but to constantly talk about it, to put it forth, to wear down the opposition, that's extremely important. On the outside, it's important to keep up the pressure. I love the progressives within, the Democratic Party and AOC and others. People thought, she and the crew weren't going to do very effective things. I think they've been found to be, in some instances, effective legislators. But they've also had to acknowledge that you can come in and with a kind of radical agenda that is progressive in ways that I think many of us find attractive, but figuring out the way to get it done is not necessarily selling out. That you got to figure out a balance between working with others. Congresswoman Norton was speaking about, if it's one of you, that's one thing. If it's a group of you, if it's a caucus, and you're trying to figure out, how to leverage your authority and how to use your political prowess and power, that's a different story. And sometimes that means compromising. That means you can't get done what you want to get done. I was reading this article yesterday about the recall of the DA in San Francisco, and his mother and father were weathermen, back in the 70s. And they got put in jail, and then he got sent to live with Bill Ayers and Bernadette Doran. Wow. I mean, this guy had four parents, two groups of parents who were like radical resistors of society. And they were skeptical, but then he chose to become a DA. Oh my God, you're a prosecutor, now you're gonna put people in jail. But he figures, like Larry Krasnow in Philadelphia, let me get inside the system and figure out what to do, because you can either, curse at the system and say it's all bad, or you can get in there and try to fix it and do something that's meaningful. I think that's a kind of compromise that a lot of people think is selling out. But I think unless you have that authority, unless you have that will, unless you have that ability to either push the people to do so, and then once the people get inside to figure out how to balance the demand for radical social change with the politics of pragmatism, I think you won't be very successful.
I mean, I want to pick up this theme of the politics of pragmatism, or thinking in general about how do we go about getting things done, especially in a representative assembly. And Congresswoman, as I noted in my introduction, the Center for Effective Lawmaking has had you consistently ranked among the top 10 most effective Democratic lawmakers in the House for every Congress in the last 10 years, and in the top 10 even before that, and the #1 most effective lawmaker in the House for 2 Congresses over the last 10 years. Myself, my co-director, Craig Volden of the Baden School, I mean, we literally have a page in our new members guide that we circulate to all newly elected members of the House and Senate that identify best practices in lawmaking with a big picture of you on it, and discussing, certain things that you've accomplished over your time here. And coming back to the point that Dr. Dyson was raising, what can you tell us about your approach to the lawmaking process? I mean, bluntly speaking, why do you think you're so successful at advancing your agenda, especially given your particularly unique position representing the District of Columbia?
Well, first of all, if it's, as you mentioned, I represent the District of Columbia, which is the least empowered part of our country, does not have 2 senators. I can't approach my job, therefore, based on what I can't do, or else I would never get anything done. So I act like I can get as much done as any other member of Congress. And by acting that way and proceeding that way, I have been able to get bills passed. Now, you don't get bills passed by simply introducing bills, and I introduce more bills than most members of Congress. That's step one. Then you've got to figure out how to get the bill passed. That means working in committee. Most of all, for example, I have the vote in committee. That's very useful. I can pass bills in committee, but then when they go to the House floor until the district gets statehood, I can't vote on my own bills. Well, if I stood by thinking about what I couldn't do, then your rankings of me as being effective simply wouldn't happen. So the most important thing I do is to simply align myself with other members of Congress and dare anybody to call me out on it.
Would you be willing to identify the people who you're most happy to align yourself with?
I align myself with those who allow my bills to get to the floor.
Okay. That's a completely accurate answer. I appreciate that. Turning it back to you, Dr. Minta, diving into the weeds a little bit in your book, when you're exploring the relationship between diversity in legislative committees and the scope of interest groups and getting their initiatives moved through the committee, would you claim that one of the broad lessons that follows from your book is that essentially the diversity in formal legislative institutions, broadly speaking, do you think that's necessary in order to get these institutions to focus on or at least facilitate the initiatives of minority interests? I mean, this is obviously a really crucial question in contemporary policymaking. Do you feel that we need to have, I guess bluntly speaking, more persons of color in order to ensure that the institution is focusing on these policy concerns of communities of color?
Short answer, yes.
Okay. Do you want to give the long answer?
Yeah, I'll give the long answer, yes. Yes, definitely. Dr. Dyson brought up about Cory Booker being there at that committee. And, women have raised the same concern when Clarence Thomas was nominated. If they had more women on that panel, maybe they would have took those charges. That information was there. The FBI had that information. Maybe they would have looked at it a little bit more closely. Now, in terms of voting on a bill, anybody can go up there and vote on a bill, right? But when you're talking about how it can affect a group, how it can affect their lives, it's good to have someone with a lived experience. If you're talking about reproductive health, it might be a good idea to have some women in there. Not saying guys can't talk about it, but it might be a good thing to have some women in there. And you see those type of examples. If you're talking about, police brutality or racial profiling, man, it might be good. A bunch of white guys in there talking about it probably is only going to get you so far. Can they bring up the relevant issues? Yeah, interest groups, they can read, they got staff, they can bring that up. But boy, it's effective if you can have someone say, hey, I know I've been pulled over by the police. Or if you're talking about immigration reform, having people who actually either been immigrants or have family members who are immigrants who can bring perspectives to the issue. So in a lot of ways, if we're talking about voting on legislation, anybody could probably do it. But if we're talking about having a conversation about issues, what goes into a bill, what that provision is going to mean to a particular community, then you need to have someone in there who's familiar with that. I wanted to say something, if you
go
don't
for
mind.
it. Come on.
No, I was just thinking about kind of the evolution of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I remember Adam Clayton Powell was the main civil rights activists for a long time. And, you know, when the organizers of the CBC, when they were coming, they were like, yeah, we're thinking about forming a caucus. And Adam Clayton Powell said, why do we need a caucus? I never needed one. It's just me, right? So, but the forward thinking to say, look, we need to have, especially as more members started coming in, we need to have an organized group where if we can get, as you said with Congressman Stokes, saying we need to have coverage on these committees, not just civil rights, you know, economic issues affect blacks, health affects black, taxes, all of that stuff affects blacks, and we need to have a voice on those committees. So the foresight to get, and a lot of groups have followed that model. I mean, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Asian and Pacific Islander, I mean, all these different groups have organized in caucuses as a way to share information, to get on committees, provide a voice, share strategy, and that's an evolution. Now, the one thing that's going to be interesting, I think, for all these groups as they become larger, I think the CBC has one of its largest delegations, and it's growing, and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus is growing, and I imagine the Congressional Asian and Pacific Islander will grow too, is the growing diversity that comes with that. For a long time, the Congressional Black Caucus was mostly blacks representing these northern areas, these cities. Now you're getting more people from the South, you're getting more rural areas that are kind of coming in, and so that's going to create somewhat some tension within the caucus. I mean, the caucus is definitely more than just the conscience of Congress anymore. It's about getting things done. But now when you have that more diversity within that caucus, how do you define black interests? What's the black agenda? Latino caucus, I mean, it's Mexican Americans, Cubans, Cubans aren't in it, but Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans. What are Latino interests? How do you define it? Is immigration the main issue? Is it health care? Is it education? I think as these caucus continue to diversify, we're going to see more of those kind of internal struggles on what's the best strategy for addressing ostensibly black interests and also Latino interests.
I mean, Dr. Dyson, I want to get your thoughts on that a couple of points that Dr. Minta raised. And one is, essentially, if it's necessary, or at least constructive, to have more diversity, more persons of color to represent the interests of communities of color, what do you feel are the implications for other less organized or, rapidly evolving communities? I mean, how do they find representation from outside the institution if their own policy agenda might be evolving so dynamically, there aren't enough of them, there isn't critical mass, so to speak? How do you think these issues really get to the forefront in the American political agenda so that once in the public domain, people in Congress, such as the Congresswoman, could engage with these considerations directly?
Right. No, and you've raised the heart of a paradox. And, people of color and other minoritized and racialized groups are often, well, you're all hanging out together. Why don't you join? Why are all the black kids sitting at the table, so to speak, right? But then, if it ain't enough of us, when we, join these other colloquies and caucuses and stuff, and if we don't have them, as Dr. Minta was talking about them, and we're out here as, quote, individuals, but we find ideological versus racialized or genderized, lines of affiliation, then we're lost in the sauce, so to speak. So I think we have to have the very thing that Congresswoman Norton is talking about is like, I don't give a darn attitude, like we got to do what we got to do, and let's get together, figure this stuff out, and go forward. And it's extremely important, if in the universe of television watching, most channels look like what you want them to look like, you don't necessarily understand the importance of BET, right? I remember when I was at Brown University, and my wife and son is like 92, and my son was getting called racial epithets. My wife, who's very gregarious and, has never met a stranger, wasn't necessarily integrated into the larger fabric of the social life there for, a variety of reasons, and race being one of them. And so, I used to summarize it by saying, look, we had one soul food restaurant. We had to drive to Boston to get it. It was like, what was it, Bob the chef? I don't know. I can't remember. Yeah, right. We would drive like an hour to go to the soul food restaurant, And there was no BET. They were like, what? My son, you can't watch BET. You got all these other channels, right? You got VH1 and VH1 and all that. So when you're minoritized and you're on the margin, now with cable TV, the young people can't even imagine what the hell I'm talking about, because, when we were coming up, I know with Congresswoman as well, I'm sure Dr. Minta is the youngest of us all, but, we had CBS, ABC, and NBC. And when they started playing the national anthem, dog, it wasn't about Colin Kaepernick. It was about the TV is about to go off. I know y'all can't imagine. Dun, 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 dun. All right, that's it. John Wayne is over. Clint Eastwood. The TV is about to go black. I mean, young people would just have a rebellion right now. What? Television is going off? Y'all got 1,000 channels. You got 50 sports channels. You got golf channels. We had darn 3 channels. And, but now that you have that landscape where you have so much diversity, then you can represent interests. We didn't know about 24-hour news. Now you got CNN and MSNBC and now the streaming services and so on. So the rapid proliferation and evolution of difference has really adopted the model that it once spurned. It spurned aggregates of people organizing around particular interests of gender and race. But what is cable TV but that? What are the organizations in our culture, but that, emulating what they already demonize. So I think it's important to hang out together, to get a sense of what it is, but also to recognize the diversity from within. And to have an independent thought. That's extremely important. Now, some people say, well, why don't you, look at what Lindsey Graham, who's now indicated that he won't vote for Ketanji Brown Jackson. Wow, we're really shocked. And it's because, no, she's qualified, but I don't think she'll use the law in a certain way and so on and so forth. Well, he's saying, well, why didn't you vote for Janice Rogers? So any black person will do. Is that what it is? So we'll just throw them out there. The very thing they're arguing against, which is let's defer to and genuflect before the altar of ethnic or racial or gender pride, the very thing that black people showed, no, we ain't gonna vote for you just because you're black. That's not what we're doing here, right? Barack Obama was not in the lead when he first announced that he was running for president. It was Hillary Clinton. My wife was for Hillary, I was for the winner. And I mean, I'm sorry. That's it. I'm sorry. I meant Barack Obama. But I wanted Hillary in when she ran again. I'm just telling you. So the thing is that black people we know the Clintons. We don't know you. I mean, so we're going to be down with people who are down with us. And so I think at the end of the day, what these contingencies, these constellations, these caucuses do is to remind us that all of us need to organize along that fashion. All of us have got to get our things, our visions together and put our marbles in circles where people acknowledge us. And I think that it's extremely important that even as we acknowledge the diversity in these smaller groups, that it's also important to have an overarching concern that needs to be articulated, whether it's AAPI or indigenous people, First Nation people, African American, Latino, lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, and the like. I mean, all of that stuff is not just an alphabet lineup of diversity. It's about real contribution to the substance of American democracy.
Alan, if I could just briefly add, so when people ask me the question, and I don't know what group you're talking about in particular, but when people say about whites, they're like, CBC, CHC, they're racist. You want me to have a congressional white caucus? I said, well, U.S. Senate.
Right.
And you already have that.
Right.
House of Representatives, even though it's more diverse than it's ever been.
Right.
But most of that diversity is on the Democratic side, not on the Republican side. Gender diversity, so that's why I just tell people the default category as much progress has been made in terms of diversifying the United States Congress, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so these groups, they're organized. I mean, maybe it would be nice to one day where you had so much diversity in these institutions and you wouldn't need these caucuses, but I don't see that coming anytime soon. So.
I mean, Congresswoman, I want to pick up this theme a little bit regarding diversity and interests and how it maps into policy strategy. And, you know, if we dive into your recent and to some degree current legislative agenda, thinking about your experiences in the 116th Congress, for example, you know, we at the center have dived into the data, have demonstrated that, you know, your legislative successes came in a bunch of different policy areas. In fact, you know, you were among the highest performing lawmakers in issues involving transportation, civil rights, public lands, government operations, for which you were actually the most successful lawmaker in the House at advancing policies related to government operations. And when we're talking about diversity of interests outside of the chamber and the ways in which members, you know, seek to represent that diversity of interests, I'd be wondering if, you know, you could comment on what do you see as the benefits or perhaps trade-offs between moving forward a broad agenda that engages with lots of these different considerations versus one that's a bit more focused on a certain area of expertise?
I think you can be focused and broad at the same time. I have to be focused given my unique status in the Congress and my determination to get something done. But to give you an example of how I insist upon being broad, I'm in the Ukraine caucus. And we met with the Ukraine representatives just yesterday. In fact, I'm in so many caucuses, it's hard for me to keep track of them. And most of them have nothing to do with being either a woman or being Black, much less the District of Columbia. You've got to spread your wings in the Congress and not compartmentalize yourself. Remember the issues that come before the House of Representatives in particular. They are across the map. So if you are too focused on the narrow interests of your jurisdiction, you won't meet their interest in broader issues. So my own record is being very broad-based and being very narrowly focused at the same time.
And as a follow-up, I'm curious, because when you were describing your very earliest days in Congress, it's clear you were very proactive. You're not going to be defined by potential limitations of the office, given that you're representing the district. You know, this broad in focus, but still targeted in terms of your goals. Was that your view on legislating when you first were elected, or is that a perspective that evolved over time that contributed to your current successes?
Now I came into the Congress understanding who I was, the so-called least empowered district with a broad agenda to get everything that every other member could get done. A lot of this has to do with how you conceive yourself. If you conceive yourself, particularly in the House of Representatives, narrowly, you will get at best bills that are narrowly focused. But when I came to the House, it occurred to me that I had to define myself in exactly the same way that every other member of the House of Representatives did, more broadly perhaps than some. And your discussion of caucuses is a very good example of how you can define yourself broadly in the Congress instead of defining yourself so narrowly that sometimes you won't even represent the interests of your own constituent.
Thank you. We have a bit of time left, but I wanted to engage with some broader questions or broader issues of representation. And to do that, Dr. Dyson, I want to turn back to you, and more specifically, I want to think about your 2016 book on President Obama. And in the preface of the book, you write that President Obama in your words, essentially engaged with three forms of representation. I'm probably going to pepper this with quotes that hopefully are not out of context. But you said, first of all, he represents, quote unquote, all of us as Americans, because he stands as a symbol of America to the world. So that's the broad notion of this is the president representing the broader constituency. But beyond that, he also represents, quote, to the American citizenry, proof of progress in a nation that has never before embraced a black commander-in-chief. And third, quote, Obama is also representative of a black populace that until his election had been excluded from the highest reach of political representation. And some of that some of that comports really nicely with the points you were raising earlier. I'm curious to know your perspective on these different levels of representation, and do you think they apply to all elected office? I mean, president is obviously unique, so let's just put that aside for the moment. But thinking about, the Congresswoman, for example, or just members of Congress, even lower levels of elected office, state legislators, local mayors, do you feel the persons of color essentially have to or do engage with these multiple levels of representation simultaneously in the general sense, or is it a function of where they are, who they represent, where they live?
No, I think it's all that, and I think they do, no matter what level you're at, whether you're a dog catcher or whether you're the President of the United States of America, whether you're a distinguished Congresswoman, and I'm not sure if you told Congresswoman Norton that she gets $1 million for being the leading figure, but since she can't take it, she's going to donate it to me. So it's going to be a great day.
Indeed.
But look, the representationality, if we're going to say it that way, excuse the barbarism of that infelicitous phrase, but you're representative by virtue of who you are. And you're representative by virtue of the function and the role that you exercise and that you possess. And you're representative because the people see you that way. So, if there are people who look to Congresswoman Norton who ain't in her district, I can guarantee you. She's a national leader. Women, people of color, and others see in her leadership a valiant, path to redemptive politics that are both progressive and pragmatic. And so I think it's extremely important for us to understand that, there's the symbolism of representation is one thing, but its actual exercise is extremely important, not to dismiss the symbolic. If we're sitting up here debating, for instance, Judge Brown Jackson, who will soon perhaps become the first black woman on the Supreme Court, the unabashed temerity, the gall, the ludicrous character, as Mike Tyson might say, of all of these white guys sitting up there going, well, what? Why don't you get the best person, not the white person? Well, you might not have a job if that were the case, right? We don't have to read the book on mediocrity and look at, white men as Chris Rock, of recent note, said that we'll have real progress when mediocre black people can be just as successful as mediocre white people. Thank you. That's through the mask. She gets extra points for that. So the thing is that how dare you sit up here and act as if you got everything you got because you were smarter and better and all that stuff, and that it doesn't make a difference you're being a male and you're being a white male and so on and so forth. We ain't dissing y'all. We're just saying that ain't the only smart category that can be accessed in order to represent people. And so the resistance and resentment that accumulate testify to the virtue of representation, to the power of representation, and to its necessity. When people say representation matters, it really does. And I think that it's extremely necessary to continue to push the envelope and to get people into the fray that make a difference. Because as Dr. Minta was saying earlier, that lived experience makes a hell of a difference. What about if we had actual, people who were transitioning or transitioned in conversations about transitioning or transition? What about if we actually had somebody who had gone through that? And it doesn't mean that they're going to think one thing. It doesn't mean that they're going to have a preset viewpoint. It means that the richness and nuance of their perspective will help contribute to a radically, democratic, small d, polity that helps us as a nation figure out where we're going to go and what we're going to do. So to answer your question, yeah, it's extremely important as function, as role, as symbol. And, when you think about a person like an Obama, in that book, of course, I was both praiseworthy of the president and extremely critical of him as well, because I think then people can manipulate representation in ways that are damaging. And that despite their representational authority, like, speaking of Chris Rock again, I'm sorry, President Obama, quotes some of Chris Rock. Black people always want to get credit for stuff that they should do, like, when Chris Rock says, a guy will say, hey, I take care of my kids. He said, you fool, you're supposed to take care of your kids, right? But then he doesn't quote the other part of Chris Rock, who says that, white people have been indebted to white supremacy in a way and have had privileges and advantages that have been uninterrogated. Obama ain't quoting that part. So even as he is representative of us, regardless of his desire, just by showing up as a black man, he's representative. On the other hand, there are some definite choices that have to be made within that context of representation that are sometimes better than other choices that might be made. So yeah, it's extremely important, however, at the end of the day.
Thank you. Congresswoman, I'm mindful of your time, but I did not want to end this session without speaking to you about a specific issue of representation that I know is very important to you, and that being DC statehood. And I would just be really curious to hear your perspectives, as I'm sure people in the audience, both Zooming in and live, really regarding your perspectives of the importance of DC statehood, in particular as it pertains to communities of color and race and representation inside and outside of Congress.
Well, this may be the most important bill that I have passed or could ever pass. Yes, it's important to people of color, but it's really quite beyond that. The district has been a majority white population for most of its time, for most of its existence. Mm-hmm. In the 70s, it became majority black. Now it's back to very quickly becoming, it's now 50-50, but it will shortly be majority white again. So the notion of representation becomes important no matter who you represent. And I have been very, very fortunate. As the population of the District of Columbia has changed, to have engaged with them with bills that brought them to me. And when you think of the Congress in particular, one has to think about evolving populations and whether the member is capable of evolving with her own district.
And it goes without saying, I would expect that your constituents appreciate your effective lawmaking and your ability to evolve with their policy agenda as well.
They follow me very, very closely and see me evolving with their interests. And when I say follow me closely, remember, we're not talking about a population that remains stable. I indicated that the city is on its way to becoming majority white again. So that if you are to be an effective member of Congress, that ought not matter, because those people will flow into your district because like-minded people tend to gather in the same district, white or black.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We're at the end of our time, and as I said, I want to be very mindful of the Congresswoman's time here. If we could please give our panelists a welcome round of applause.
In the audience.
And Congresswoman, we'll hope to have you in Nashville as soon as you'd like to be here. You're always welcome.